Hello again. We are here with Tom Sinclair, who was one of the directors and is still one of the directors, but is now also the joint chair of Repair Cafe Wales. Thank you very much for joining us, Tom.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Now, could you give us a brief intro into your background first of all? What you do outside of Repair Cafe Wales?
Yeah, so joined Repair Cafe Wales about a year ago, and my background is in finance, so working in finance within large corporates, primarily telcos over the last 10 years or so, or telco media companies. So kind of moved through the finance ranks. Started at Sky and worked in some of their European companies there as they were involved in acquisition, and now I work at O2, which is also going through a piece of M&A at the moment as it potentially merges with Virgin Media to form a fairly large telco.
I didn't know that. Gosh.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
Wow.
And so I've done a variety of different finance roles there, primarily the more front office ones. Not so many of the sort of back office technical accounting points.
Okay, and how and why did you get involved with Repair Cafe Wales?
I was looking for an opportunity to share my skills that I've gained over the last 10 to 15 years with an organisation that with whose values I share, and I came across Repair Cafe Wales simply by looking, of course, and using the internet. I'm not from Wales, I don't live in Wales, and actually because of the way we've been working over the last 12 months, I've only met several of the people from Repair Cafe Wales once in person. All the rest has been on video calls. But the ethos of Repair Cafe Wales is reducing landfill, sharing skills, creating community cohesion, and that's a really nice thing. If you're going to give your time voluntarily, that for me is a nice thing to give my time to. And of course it's just about need then, and Repair Cafe Wales is a fairly young and nascent organisation, but a growing one, didn't have at the time anyone with the sort of financial stewardship skills on board, so it was a good match.
I guess it's a very different type of organisation to what you're used to.
Yeah, working in a big corporate, you get lots of advantages. Some stuff will just work because there's a central department that manages it. If it's IT or procurement or something like that, those things exist. And of course, what the bureaucracy and red tape and rules and guidelines are that go along with that as well. And that, sometimes they're there for a reason, but of course they feel like a downside if you're battling red tape. When it comes to Repair Cafe Wales, it's very fluid. I can phone or email one or two people and we can either get things done or not. So more through force of will than any kind of strict rule-based system.
Yes. Okay. And so start off with not start off, but the next one's a bigger question, which is around I guess if you could paint a loosely realistic picture of where you would like to see Repair Cafe Wales in 5 years' time, roughly, I don't mean the sort of group view, I just mean your own take on it. What would that look like?
So if you look at I'm aware of what the group view is, and if you look at the recent history of Repair Cafe Wales, it's been starting up repair cafes in cities, towns, villages, places across Wales, and increasing the number and making those available to more local communities. And we talked about in 2020 how well that works, because of course repair cafes don't lend themselves particularly well to social distancing and the pandemic that we've had. So most of them have been shut for most of the year. But we still want to reduce landfill, even if we can't quite achieve the objectives of creating community cohesion because of the impositions upon us. So we've been looking as well as the repair cafes. Options we've looked at are having a physical presence somewhere central, perhaps somewhere with large dense population like Cardiff in South Wales, to enable people to drop off things or shop effectively and have that physical presence. We've looked at mobile operation, so using a van or something to move between communities, as well as just having the sort of standing locations in those village halls and town halls are there. And we've talked about other things like partnerships and where could we partner with other organisations that share our ethos or charitable purpose. I think that's an interesting one about what we could do there, because there seems to be a lot of potential, but of course going into partnership requires not just a willing partner on the other side, but all sorts of things to work, and it creates quite a lot of complications as well. So that's one which we're interested in, or I'm interested in, but also skeptical of, because you're giving away some of the control to an extent there when you're in a partnership.
Are you on the, I mean, with your finance expertise, do you ever think Repair Cafe Wales could or should be financially self-sufficient?
It's a good question. It's one we've discussed. So, for your students, if they're not aware, we are primarily grant funded at the moment. So we receive grants from largely Welsh government and local authorities rather than central government. And there's an awful lot of different grants available for environmental and community type activity. And that said, it only goes so far. And of course, with the grant, it's always dictated, what you can spend it on. So there's certain things that you can't always do. And if you're looking to grow, it's quite difficult to use that grant money for that if it's not stipulated what you can do in the grant. So it's difficult to know where we generate enough revenue from at the moment. It's difficult to see at the moment where we'd get sufficient revenue to survive without grant funding, and then grant funding just be the sort of the bonus, the cream on top. So of course we don't sell anything as such. We do receive donations as well that are fairly small in nature. And one of the things that we've looked at trying to sell is our expertise as a team, as a management team, and a repair community to try and help others who are trying to do similar things and get other projects off the ground, that rather than them face all the same pitfalls that we faced, to try and sell that experience is one thing we've looked at. At the moment, I think it's probably a long way off that other sources of funding outstrip grant funding, but I do think it's something we should try and get towards. How far we get there, undecided.
Okay. I wanted to ask a question around sort of our opportunities that are ahead of us. Because I'm going to ask a different question actually first. So because you said, there's lots of options. Now, you've worked a lot in the private sector, where strategy, if not relatively straightforward, then at least the aim of the strategy is relatively straightforward, which is to loosely maximize shareholder returns over whatever period. In the third sector, it's slightly more complicated in that you don't have that sort of big financial flag to follow. How do you think about strategy? So I struggle with this. So when I'm thinking about strategy in the third sector, you can start off with, the environmental, I'm concerned with the environment, or I'm concerned with building communities, or concerned with reducing landfill. But each one could take us in a different direction. And I guess how do you think about strategy formulation in the third sector? Am I missing something, or is it more finger in the air? And
I think maybe you're right, because if you go think about the private sector, you have a range of investor type KPIs, usually financially based. It might be your return on capital employed, or your net asset value, or any number of financial sort of KPIs which would be on a scorecard, which analysts, investors would use to decide whether you're doing well or not. And when you're talking through your strategy, if you're a listed company, then of course the price of the shares on that day kind of dictates as well whether whether it's got consensus view and whether people like it. And there's a complete absence of that for an institution in the third sector, as far as I'm aware. I'm quite new to the third sector, so perhaps I'm speaking slightly out of turn, and there are a bunch of KPIs that the governments look at, but I'm not sure. I haven't found them yet. So it feels quite blank sheet of paper, and that's quite exciting to be involved in, because it very much feels like the small group of people who are privileged enough to define that strategy can do something without limitation, and therefore that's more exciting, groundbreaking, but also challenging, because you don't have that barometer of does it increase this number, and is that the right number, because it is not one that the FTSE 350 has as the measure. So I think you're right, and I don't think I'm not sure I know the answer, other than to say I think finger in the air, blank sheet of paper is definitely one of the ways to go. And of course personalities and discussions then tend to dominate perhaps a bit more in the absence of hard and fast rules.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I haven't really thought about it in depth, but I guess when we think about strategy, there's various influences on it. One is what we've always done, which shouldn't necessarily be the basis of strategy. One is, as you say, sort of personalities and the interactions between them. And then sort of when you're deciding between projects, there's kind of, you're constrained by the resources that you've got in pursuit of those profits. But it's
you can look at, of course, what other people around you are doing. Repair Cafe,
sure,
there was started in Europe, I think. You'll know. So the idea wasn't a complete light bulb. It's an imitation of something that's happened elsewhere, and then bespoke. So of course we look at other companies in the third sector that operate in a similar type of way as we do, to see what they do. But that's not really strategy, because you're looking at what they're doing right now rather than what they're doing in the future, I would say.
But even with, you mentioned partnerships, but even with partnerships, you have in the private sector, merger and acquisition, you look at the value of the assets, the potential value of the synergies, and then you can roughly work out your price or resource that you'll invest into it. And whereas with us, because financial value isn't the focus, even with partnerships, it's it's an interesting calculation in terms of who you partner with, the potential benefits to you as a brand, I guess, in terms of the moral good that you do. And it's a much more tricky one to suss out in some ways, I think. I don't know. Anyway, right.
I think certainly, as I said, with personalities, if it was a different bunch of people working in that management team at Repair Cafe Wales, I think they would come up with a different answer, and that's the exciting bit, and that's probably different to some of those older, more corporate companies in the private sector, where they'll probably get to a similar answer, I would think, irrespective of who's the chairman, who's the CEO.
Yes. In terms of the future, we've kind of got this once we're out of COVID, there's a plan to open as many repair cafes as possible. Do you see any obstacles or any problems with that as sort of a vision?
Implementing the vision in a COVID world, or
in a post-COVID world? I mean, does it stand up, I guess, is what I'm asking. I mean,
I mean, there is, as far as we can tell, demand for further cafes from many communities across Wales, and even in the COVID world that we're in, where several of them have been, on a forced hiatus for a long time, and where we have people who run cafes. These are volunteers. Several of them are in those vulnerable groups because they've been, elderly or have underlying health conditions. So they've certainly not been willing to mix with their communities as much. But we actually still managed to sign up more cafes this year. I think we've added another 8 or 10 recently. Now they maybe haven't got started yet, but they're going to when we come out of the lockdown restrictions. So we're still doing that, and there is still demand for it, even in the current circumstance. So I think there'll be more demand for it once we emerge into the glorious post-COVID world. I think that will continue, and I think post-COVID is an interesting point because when Repair Cafe Wales was started, it just wasn't a consideration. But for me, there's a bigger question mark of what will those changes be. We know that, or we think we know that working from home, for example, will become very normal for large swathes of people. So 5 days a week in an office won't be the same. So our city centres and sort of urban areas may change slightly. What will change in people's attitudes? Will they think, "Wow, life's too short. There's this around the corner"? Or will they change there and want to be more community focused? Do we see a continued kind of green focus? And yes, we do. But how will it manifest itself? Will it be with reduction of landfill? Or will it be people, looking to buy electric cars, which are, a more expensive status symbol than getting your kettle fixed?
Yes.
But I think the demand's still there, so I think it stands up. And I think, as I said, and this isn't my expert area, but I think there's sufficient desire we talked about being grant funded. I think there's sufficient desire and impetus in those areas of local government to continue to fund such projects whilst they appear successful and on vogue, and delivering the kind of things that politicians want to talk about. So we're going to have probably a period of higher taxes and less disposable income post-COVID to pay for the things that have happened over the last year, but it doesn't seem to have cut back funding in that area yet, as I can see.
Yeah. Yes. Whilst the present is pretty rough, the future is relatively bright for at least funding, environmental funding, I guess.
Yeah.
Especially now Biden has got in. So.
There's a lot of people will be happy about that, isn't it? It's a difficult one. It's like the whole of the UK's almost anti-Trump, aren't we? By sort of virtue of being somewhere between centre left and centre right.
Yes.
And him being an idiot, but I don't like to pass comment.
No, well, I don't know if you saw the. There's no reason why you would listen to it, but I listened to the Economist podcast, and the Economist is normally pretty conservative in its views, and they were just, they pretty much just calling him an idiot, which you would expect in conversations down the pub, but it seems to be almost official policy now.
Really accepted, yeah, exactly.
Really interesting. Anyway, okay. I'll just check my question list to see any other.
Am I answering your questions, or am I just giving vaguely?
No, you are.
Vaguely politician-like answers that move us on to the next one without having said anything.
No, you're not. There's lots to think about there. I guess one more practical thing is, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but I'm thinking more in terms of tactics. But if we were landed with a £500,000 grant in 6 months' time, which isn't, it's not a high likelihood, but you just,
it's not beyond the realms of possibility either.
Yeah. What would and let's assume that this grant is relatively loose in terms of its requirements, other than opening repair cafes, going on. What would your priorities be in terms of spend, do you think?
That is a good question. Like a chunk probably would go on expansion of existing repair cafes to make sure we're reaching, geographically the corners of Wales that we want to, making sure that we've got presence in North Wales and other areas as well as in South Wales, and that being an area that I think when you get critical mass there, the brand gets out, people know more about it, it's talked about, and you do drive. You become, it's a virtuous circle from having more presence, I think. There's areas where we'd probably like to work closer with government on, I'd say, formulating policy, but becoming a more established part of the third sector and having a bit more of a long-term vision and pipeline that's linked with what politicians, regulators, all those people are trying to do to create understanding about reduction of landfill and the benefits that we have. And of course, a lot of the things that we do rely on volunteers, but people don't have infinite time. So at some stage, there are people who we should, consider paying on a contractor or salary basis to be able to deliver some of those projects for us, working with local government. And then, wow, 500,000 is such a life-changing amount of money compared to what we usually get. It's such a big question. I'm struggling to know where to commit the rest of it.
Obviously, executive cars for all of us.
Very, very, very great. Yeah, well, Tesla for each board director,
yes.
Of course. Yeah. And after that, yeah, I'm stumped a bit. Where would you go?
Where would I go? I guess it would be nice to have a few staff to take and I guess that would be the main thing. I mean, I think Keris might want to plow a load into the marketing, because I think the brand's great already, but I think she would like more in the marketing and branding area.
Yeah, I think we realised that with things like Google search or Google advertising or Facebook advertising, whatever it is, that they're actually a black hole, and you could plow an enormous amount back into that, but we don't really, they're look, in my sort of paid professional job here, we have people who do that all day long and still don't know what the return on investment is. So for us to not understand if that's a good investment feels probably a little bit too risky for me.
Yeah. And then I guess there's some, I guess there's various opportunities to build assets in the firm. There's something that's kicked off recently, which is a potential sort of carbon calculator targeted at repair cafes. And there's a few bits and pieces like that which might add value and drive partnerships and that type of thing. So potentially, yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
I'd like to,
I'm sure we could spend it.
Yeah, I'd like to create something that says if in a couple of years' time that I'm not around at Repair Cafe and some of the other people have moved on, that it's sustainable, it's still there, and it's not relying on sort of the spare time and the efforts of a bunch of volunteers, and that it's become more of a foundation pillar in those communities, and it's sort of self-sustaining. So something that helps us drive towards that. Yeah.
Yes, I think the remakery idea is possibly that would be a nice flagship to have. And also, I guess, the other big potential revenue that we very rarely talk about, oddly, are these shops at tips. And certainly in the Swedish model, they can turn over millions. As a group. So there's opportunities there, but I don't know if we have the relationships at the moment to push that type of thing.
Yeah, the issue with waste, of course, is we create so much of it, don't we? And the for-profit sector kind of drives it, and you get why. We know that if someone comes in and you buy a new kitchen for a whole bunch of money because you want your kitchen redone, they take out all the old bits. That company don't make enough money from those old bits to do anything other than chuck them in the skip. But of course, so many of them are functioning. That's just an example. But how do we make not just secondhand reused, but those how can you incentivize people to not throw them away or disincentivize them to fill the landfill? And there's probably a long way to go in the UK on that.
Yeah, it would be nice to see. Trouble is coming up with a system that can be policed and incentivized, but some type of reward for if we calculate the cost to the council of taking things away and processing it and getting rid of it, then almost rewarding people for getting rid of it or using it in different ways or whatever. Good. Okay. Well, I don't have any more questions.